Okay, today we are going to start our chapter on plant nutrition and transport. First of all, let's talk about what we even mean when we say plant nutrition. You know what that means when we talk about humans and animals. So what exactly are nutrients for plants? And so when we talk about nutrients, we mean elements that are absorbed mostly as inorganic ions from the soil. Now we also, of course, are using organic material too as nutrients, but for right this second we're going to focus on the inorganic minerals. And so plants are basically the way that we get ions into the biosphere. Biosphere meaning everything that's living. So as we've talked about before, we start out with our rocks, and through weathering and various other processes, mechanical and chemical, ions get put into the soil. And this is where our plants absorb these ions through the roots. And as those plants grow, they become food for animals, such as cows, for instance. And then those nutrients go back onto the ground, either obviously through waste or when the animal expires, in which case then we rely on our decomposers to return those nutrients back to the soil, and the process starts all over again. So our nutrients, in particular those that we call essential nutrients, are extremely important for the plants. They have a specific identifiable role. And when we talk about essential nutrients, we mean we can't substitute something else for that particular nutrient and have that same role filled. So when the plant is deficient in any of those essential nutrients, then it's unable to function, and it's usually a breakdown in its metabolism and the plant dies. So we divide those nutrients into macronutrients and micronutrients, and that just is based on the needs of the plant. Macronutrients are needed in larger quantities, micronutrients are needed in smaller quantities. So if you look at this table on the left, our macronutrients, some of them should be pretty obvious. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Those are the top three that make up the majority of your plant. Carbon is obviously going to come from carbon dioxide in the air. Hydrogen comes from water, and then oxygen either from the air, from breakdown of water, and it is also available as air pockets in the soil. So some of the things I want to draw your attention to are nitrogen that we need in macro quantities, potassium, and then here we go, our phosphorus. And I'll show you why I'm pointing those out in a minute. Our micronutrients, if you'll remember from our soil video, here's iron. And so you have already seen how iron is absorbed by the plant roots and how the plants affect the soil around it in order to absorb that iron. Okay, so fertilizer. What we put out on plants is essentially plant food, and they contain the essential nutrients that we talked about a minute ago. So this is a photo from 1942 where the Department of Agriculture did a test where they basically starved plants or did not give them fertilizer, and those that they nourished with fertilizer, particularly phosphate and lime. And lime, just so you know, changes the pH of the soil, so that is going to be a way for helping absorb minerals from the soil. So those particular macronutrients that I pointed out before were nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And those three things are what we call the NPK ratio when you are applying fertilizer to a plant. different plants have different needs for those macronutrients, so they may need them in different concentrations. So when you're looking up a particular plant that you want to keep healthy, it's going to give you the NPK ratio, and that is how you determine which fertilizer to put on a particular plant. And this is, again, inorganic fertilizer, man-made, and these are chemicals and essential nutrients in the form of minerals. So this is just a quick review. You've seen this before, but our inorganic portion of soil starts with our basic unit, our rock, and then through all of these components here, weathering the biosphere, atmosphere, hydrosphere, and all over long periods of time, break down the rock into soil. Now, there are different soil types, and two of the things we're going to focus on with the soil types has to do with porosity and the cation exchange capacity. So porosity has to do with how much water can go between the particles of the soil, and the cation exchange capacity just basically is exactly that. It's the capacity of each particular soil particle to bind particular cations and exchange those into the roots. So when we look at porosity, we're going to look at sand, silt, and clay. Sand being the largest particles, clay being the smallest, and silt somewhere in between. So when we're looking at a healthy soil in general, it has these 5 components to it. It has 25% water, so that's our moisture, and that is going to come into play when we're looking at the porosity of the soil. It's mineral composition, so soil is made of 45% minerals, so that's the part that's broken down from rock, and that's why it takes so long to make soil, because remember, it takes about 15 years for that process to occur. It has gases in it. In particular, it needs air. It has organic matter, and it has microorganisms in it. All of those are components that are necessary for healthy soil. Okay, so let's talk about porosity. These were those 3 different particle sizes that I was talking about. So if we had soil that was purely sand, remember these are the largest particles, and you can see relative sizes here. If we poured water into our sandy soil, the water would be able to go through pretty quickly because there are lots of spaces between the particles because the particles are so large. The opposite extreme of that is clay that has tiny, tiny particles, so right here, and we have a lot of this in our North Carolina soil. So when water gets poured into it, it has a very hard time penetrating through the clay, so it does have a lot of runoff. So we would say that sand has the largest amount of porosity, the greatest porosity, and clay would have the least amount of porosity. It's important when we have a healthy soil that we have a mixture of all these particle sizes. So here's a scale that shows basically our percent clay, percent sand, percent silt, and probably the best soil for most plants is right here in the middle, this clay loam or just loam. And so that is a mixture of a whole bunch of different particle sizes, and that is healthy for most plants. Now, as you know, plants are going to have adaptations and preferences for particular types of soil. So for instance, a palm tree would grow horribly in all silt or all clay. It requires a lot of sandy soil. And so when we are talking about different soil types and what seems to be the best, that's a generalization because different plants do have different requirements. So healthy soils contain air spaces. And why do you think that might be necessary? Well, it's important for plants, just like you and I, to have oxygen for cellular respiration. So even those root cells down in the ground need that oxygen as well. So oxygen is actually absorbed through the roots so that cellular respiration can take place. So what makes the air spaces within the soil? Well, our burrowing animals that we've talked about, like worms and snakes, millipedes, rabbits, etc., and also those particle sizes. Remember, if we have large particle sizes, then we have space between them, and that's really important for creating airspace. In fact, if we overwater our plants and we fill in all those air spaces with water, we can actually suffocate the plant. So here's an example. When we go to create a lake, a man-made lake, and they dam up the river and then they create the lake, you get exactly that. You kill trees because you have now taken away the airspace for their roots. So this may look familiar. This is down near Jordan Lake. So when Jordan Lake was created, this is what happens to the trees. So healthy soil also contains clay particles. So remember we talked about the different types of soil? Healthy soils do contain a bit of clay. So clay is actually negatively charged and holds on to cations. So the root hairs contain an excess of hydrogen ions, and therefore we can do a process called cation exchange. And that means that we're swapping those hydrogen ions for the essential minerals that the plant needs. So remember when we talked about the cation exchange capacity of the different soil particles? Well, clay has a very high cation exchange capacity. And I won't go over all the details about this because we've already looked at it in one of your previous videos, but I'll walk you through it real quickly. If we're talking about iron, remember at a higher pH, the iron is bound to the soil particle and not available for absorption. And then through a proton ATPase, hydrogen ions are sent out into the soil in order to lower the pH. And that allows for the release of Fe3, and then from the soil, sorry. And then we have our ferrous reduction oxidase that then converts it to Fe2, which is a usable form of iron, and then it goes through the transport protein into the root cell. Okay, so one of the effects of what we call acid rain is that those cations can no longer bind to clay particles. And the reason for that is that the rain is mixed with air pollutants that then bind those cations or bind to the clay particles themselves where the cations would normally bind. And that means all of those important essential nutrients leach out of the soil. So when you hear that term leaching out of the soil, it just means a loss of water-soluble plant nutrients from the soil due to rain or irrigation. And this is just something important to note. Irrigation does not contain any minerals, so we can actually leach out a lot of our essential nutrients by using irrigated water or city water. Rainwater, on the other hand, still tends to pick up some of those minerals and bring them into the soil. So that's just something for you to keep in mind. So this is just an example of what a forest looks like when it's affected by acid rain and it doesn't have those minerals available. So another thing that we need to consider is erosion. And what we mean by erosion is the movement, or the removement, I should say, of the topsoil portion of soil. And that topsoil is what contains all the organic and inorganic nutrients that are necessary for plants. So let's just take a look at our column over here. Down here is bedrock. If it helps you to think about it, underneath is going to be our magma, basically. And so as it cools, you get solid rock. Then that rock starts to break apart as the Earth's crust moves. So that is another mechanical way of breaking down rock. And then here's our subsoil, which has kind of broken down rock as well as some mineral that comes from above. And then topsoil. Topsoil is that all-important area. It has the well-decomposed organic matter. It has many of the decomposers live here. When we have plant roots, they come down here into the topsoil. So this is where most of our inorganic and organic nutrients reside. And then there's this top little section here of leaf litter and some plant life. Okay, so when we're talking about erosion, we're talking about the removal of this portion here, the topsoil, the all-important version that the plants need. And that's usually carried away by wind or by water. Our best, or maybe worst, example of erosion is, of course, the Dust Bowl. And that happened on the Great Plains of America and Canada in the 1930s. It kind of came in three waves, in 34, 36, and 39. And essentially it was just, I think, a misunderstanding. There used to be these grasses on these prairies, and the grasses that grew there naturally had very deep roots that could reach deep in the soil and get water. So even for periods where it was dry for a long time, some droughts, it still could keep moisture. And those grasses kept the topsoil in place. So when farmers came along and they did deep plowing, they took up all the natural grasses and then also tilled up all that virgin topsoil, and then planted crops that were shallow rooted. And so even when they harvested, they took out the entire plant, and that just left the plains completely bare and nothing to hold down that topsoil. So then those dust storms that came through, they removed all the topsoil, and that meant that that area was no longer good for planting soil, and people starved because of their lack of knowledge about this information. So here's just some quick bullet points on lessons that we learned from the Dust Bowl. We learned about crop rotation. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Cover crops, basically planting things that will not leave the soil bare when you harvest. The other thing was, let me see if I see it in here. Yes, the last one, leave high stubble after harvest. So in other words, don't take away the entire plant. Like if you have corn and you just take off the ears of the corn, don't take the entire plant out and leave the soil bare. People in the Midwest now plant windbreaks. You know, there you can see these large fences or tall trees in the middle of a field because it's stopping the winds from wiping across. Reducing herd size so you don't take up all the plants in that area, and plowing along the contour lines of the plains so that you go with the way things are naturally put in. And then furrowing fields at right angles to the prevailing wind so that you're not kicking everything up. Okay, so what happens if you are a plant living in an area that has poor soil and you lack nutrients? What adaptations are there? What are the variety of plants, like how do they adapt to it? There are 5 adaptations for mineral uptake. And the first is what we call epiphytes. Plants that live on another plant to collect rainwater and minerals, and they have adventitious or aerial roots. So our examples of these are things like orchids or Spanish moss that might be familiar to you, and also here are the bromeliads. Here's this beautiful orchid. And the Spanish moss, I'm familiar with Spanish moss, having lived in Florida for a long time. If you're down near the coast, you'll see a lot of that. The second way that plants adapt to poor soil is by utilizing what we call mycorrhizae. And what mycorrhizae is a symbiotic relationship of the plant root with a fungi. And this increases the surface area of the roots for absorption. So it helps to absorb those nutrients from the soil. The more space you can cover, the more nutrients you can absorb. So here's the difference between a plant that does not have mycorrhizae and one that does. You see how much healthier the one is with mycorrhizae. And just so you know, like 95% of plants out in nature naturally have these mycorrhizal relationships. We also can go to the ag store and buy plant fertilizer that also contains mycorrhizae within it to boost our plant nutrient absorption. A third method is parasitism. So parasitism is obtaining nutrients from another living organism without benefiting that other organism. So it's slightly different than a symbiotic relationship. And the daughter plant is like the prime example. It has a peg structure called a haustoria, and essentially what it does is it works like a hypodermic needle, and it fits right into the vascular tissue of the plant that it is attaching to, and just takes the nutrients directly from it. Plants can also be carnivorous plants. If they live in poor soils, they need to get more nutrients, and it's just not happening. This is very common in the bogs of eastern North Carolina, the bogs and the swamps. You're familiar with Venus flytrap, also pitcher plants. They all have these certain ways of attracting usually insects. They can sometimes even be tiny rodents, but particularly small insects, and trapping them. And then they have these digestive enzymes that basically digest the organism alive sometimes dead, and use the nutrients. And the fifth is another symbiotic relationship of plant roots, but this time in particular, it's with a bacteria. And this is particularly true of plants in the legume family, like peas and soy and alfalfa. And the bacteria that engage in this symbiotic relationship do what's called nitrogen fixation for these roots, and the roots create these root nodules for the bacteria to live in. So the bacteria that is found in these particular roots are called rhizobium bacteria. And the rhizobium put out these signals to the plant cells, particularly the root hair cells. And once the plants see these chemical signals, they start to form a nodule, which is kind of like a bulb of tissue. And that becomes the place where the bacteria, the rhizobium bacteria, live within the roots of the legume plant. And so the symbiotic relationship is that the nitrogen that's within the soil is changed into a usable form for the plants. The bacteria make enough that they can use some of it and they have enough left over for the plants. And then the plants, of course, are providing extra sugar for the bacteria to live with. So this is what's happening inside the bacteria. So a molecule of nitrogen gas is going to bind to a specific enzyme called a nitrogenase. And once it does, then it's going to be reduced with 3 pairs of hydrogen atoms. And then what's left over is ammonia and an ammonium ion. And so the ammonia, it dissolves in the cell in the water to form that ammonium ion, and that is then the usable form that the plants can use. So one important thing is that the NH4 that's taken up by the plant is used, but there's also an abundance left over behind in the soil. And so these particular types of plants are used in what we call crop rotation. And what that means is that you have a particular plant that may normally use up a lot of the nitrogen in the soil, or after having been there a while, then that particular mineral or nutrient is used up in the soil. So what we would do is then come behind the plant that we've been trying to grow, like lettuce or carrots or even corn, and then for the next year we would grow a legume such as peas or soy in that area, because they're going to naturally have that symbiotic relationship, and then the extra nitrogen in usable form is then put back into the soil for then the following year when we grow our target crop again. We can also do parallel crop rotation. So if we're looking at this image here, the next year we would take this corn down and plant soybean, and we'd plant the corn right here. Okay, next we're going to switch gears a little bit. We've talked a lot about soil and the components, and now we want to talk about how do we get nutrients all throughout the plant. So we need water to be moved throughout the plant, and we need sugars to be moved throughout the plant. How does that work? So I'm going to let you kind of go through the next couple of slides that just review chemical properties of water. I won't read all that out to you. You've had it before, but it is important that you know it and understand it for how water and nutrients get taken through the plant. Okay, so you've learned about the properties of water and reviewed those. And so right now I just want to look at one last definition is osmosis, and that's the movement of water from an area of high concentration to low concentration, and that's going through a selectively permeable membrane like the plasma membrane. And the point of osmosis in plants is to get the solutes into equilibrium. Well, I guess that's the point of osmosis overall. But we're going to start by talking about water movement throughout the plant. So why is that even important? Well, as you know, with most cells, water makes up the majority of the cell itself. And so we have what's called turgor pressure, which is the force within the cell that pushes the plasma membranes out. And in plant cells, that means out against the cell wall. So that pressure is exerted by the osmotic flow of water. And so because a plant doesn't have bones, it doesn't have an exoskeleton, that turgor pressure is what allows for a plant to be upright. So each one of those cells, all stacked one against another, with its turgor pressure allows for a plant to be upright. And so if you think about the larger the plant, the more water it's going to require in order to maintain that turgor pressure. And so when we don't water a plant enough, for instance, then the plasma membrane starts to pull away from the cell wall, and we get this wilting effect like you see in this picture here. So how do we get water into the plant in general? Well, of course it starts in the roots, and particularly with the root hairs. And there's two different pathways for how the water gets into the plant. One is the symplastic, and the other is what we call the apoplastic. Symplastic simply means that the water enters each and every cell that it comes into contact with, starting with the root hair. So it enters in through the root hair, stays within the cell, and it passes from cell to cell to cell, just like this, all through the ground tissue. And then it hits the endodermis. The endodermis is this particular layer right here that we've talked about. And in the endodermis, there is what's called the Casparian strip. And what the Casparian strip is, it's water impermeable, and it only goes around the outsides of the sidewalls. So as the water comes in, then within the endodermis, that's where regulation of water takes place. How much water does the plant need to come in? And then it is sent through the cells into the xylem, and then through the xylem it is then transported vertically up through the plant. Now the second way that it can enter is apoplastically. So again, in through the root hair, and then it goes weaving in between all the different cells. So note that it's moving through the intercellular space, so between the cells, and that's going to happen all through this ground tissue until it comes to the endodermis. And because of the Casparian strip that is on the outside of these cells, that water can no longer go between the cells, but it is forced into the endodermal cells. So whether you are using symplastic or apoplastic, either one, it's going to go within the endodermal cells because that's where the regulation takes place. And then from there, it goes in through the xylem and is transported vertically. Okay, so how is this going to go through the entire plant? We've talked about the symplastic and apoplastic ways that the water enters in through the root hairs, and then it hits the xylem. Well, once it's in the xylem of the roots, it's going to go up through the plant. And the reason for that is because due to cohesion, each of those water molecules is pulled along like a chain because they are attached to each other. and they are also attached through adhesion to the xylem through these vessel elements, and up it goes all the way up into the vascular tissue of the leaves, and then it's going to be drawn out of the plant through transpiration. And remember, transpiration is basically just evaporation through the leaves. That's the best way to describe it. So there are these what we call stomata, which are holes in the leaves, and so the water is drawn up through cohesion and adhesion, and then through transpiration goes outside of the plant, and about 90% of water is lost through evaporation out through these stomata. So water transport through the xylem then has all of these facets that we just talked about: cohesion and adhesion, evaporation. Transpiration, again, is just evaporation through the leaves. And then it's important to understand potential energy and water potential. So potential energy, if you'll remember in your basics physics class, is just stored energy of a material with the capacity to do work. So if you think about a ball at the top of a hill, that has a lot of potential energy, and then it's released as it goes downhill, right? So water potential is the same thing, but it's the potential energy of the water. So if you think about a waterfall, all the water up here at the top has a really high water potential, and then it is all released so that at the bottom now we have low water potential. And in a plant, there's high water potential in the roots, and then as it moves up the plant, it loses energy, and at the very top, when we have the release through transpiration, we have low water potential. So we begin, again, at the roots, like we talked about, through root pressure is what it's called. And the reason that we even draw water in is because the root has the ability to store ions. And so it stores that solute, which gives it a high osmotic potential. So that water wants to come into those roots. And that's the storing of the solutes is done by active transport. But then the root pressure, or the osmotic pressure for water to come in, is through, obviously, osmosis. So what causes that root pressure? Remember we talked about minerals entering through the root hairs, and we talked about the cation exchange capacity, and so some of that is going to require ATP, so it's active transport. So as that comes into the root hairs, then water follows through by osmosis. At the very top of the plants, then, we have this really cool phenomenon called guttation, and that's caused by the root pressure. So because the water is coming in, it's like it's being pushed through the plant. So sometimes, particularly in the morning, if you'll remember, our stomata is generally closed at night because of the lack of blue light. And the reason then we get what's called guttation is that if we don't have the stomata open on its own and transpiration naturally occurring, because remember we said 90% of that water just is constantly being flown through the plant and out through transpiration. Well, if we have those stomata, or those openings, closed, then that root pressure forces some of this water out of the stomata, particularly on the margins of the leaves, and so it gets this lovely water quality. And this is also what we would call morning dew, okay? But if you look at it real closely, it's because that water is being forced out of the stomata. So that whole process is called the cohesion tension model. That's what we call how water gets through the plant. And so the next couple of slides are going to walk you through that, and I'm just going to let you read those together. It's just a review of what we just said. So the cool thing about all of this water transpiring through plants is that this creates water vapor in the air. And that water vapor is extremely important for our climate. This is our source of rainfall. So all that water that's being pulled up through roots, all the way up through the plant, transpiring out the leaves, then allows for cloud formation and then rainfall. Now, the other benefit of that is what we call evaporative cooling. So these plants, they don't sweat and they can't move into the shade when they're hot, but the more that water that they can pull through their the whole organism and then release at the top. Remember, evaporation is always cooling. That's how we cool off with our sweat. Well, plants can do this just through transpiration, so they do also cool off by evaporative cooling. Okay, so what about the sugars? We've learned how we can get water throughout the plant, and it always goes from the roots up to the shoots and the leaves. So what about the sugar? So just like water is transported through xylem, the sugars are transported through the phloem, and that's a process called translocation. So sugar is made in basically all those areas of a plant that can photosynthesize. And those, let me back up. That's also true, but if you also remember, seeds store sugar, right? So even though they aren't photosynthesizing at the moment, they're a source of sugar. So all those places where sugars are is called the source. And so plants move sugars through translocation from the source to what we call the sink. And the sink are the areas of the plant that need the sugars. So what areas would need sugar? Well, particularly the roots would generally need sugars if they aren't storing any at the time. Flowers would need it. Meristematic regions are those areas that are constantly dividing new cells. They're going to need a lot of sugar. And then what areas, excuse me, would then produce sugars? Well, that would be your large leaves, your stems, and like I said before, if you have a storage spot, then that would also be an area of which would be called a source. So translocation always occurs from the source to the sink. So it's not quite as simple as our water movement. Water movement pretty much starts at the bottom, moves to the top. Well, with sugars, it can go anywhere, up or down or sideways. So in order to understand our phloem translocation, this particular model is called the pressure flow model. So the first step is that the sugars are being made mostly by photosynthesis in leaves or in green stems. And then that sugar is actively transported into the phloem cells at those source locations. Once you have a concentration of sugars, then water flows in naturally by osmosis. And that influx of water causes the flow of those sugars to go from the source to the sink. And that's just across, we always follow concentration gradients, basically from high concentration to low concentration. Once we're at the sink, the sugar is actively pumped out of the phloem so that other cells other than phloem can undergo cellular respiration. And then the leftover water that's in the phloem is then it flows into the xylem and then can be transported just like our normal water transport. Okay, so this is kind of fun. What happens to aphids when they drink that sucrose solution from the phloem? Because you know aphids have this basically hypodermic needle that they put in, and it has an anticoagulant, so nothing blocks it up. Well, the interesting thing is the excess, because of the pressure from all that phloem, the excess comes out their other side, out their little hiney, and that is called honeydew. So just an interesting fun thing to end on. Some species of ants actually farm aphids because they eat the honeydew off their little rear ends. So just fun information. I hope that you enjoyed plant nutrient and transport today. It's a lot to take in, but you guys got it.